All right, what is going on, boyos? We're doing another tier list today. I really like this tier list type video format because, on some level, it's fun. People like watching them. It's something you can listen to in the background. But on another level, it's also pretty easy to make these into something that is informational, and I can pass on some quality information alongside maybe some entertainment. And what we're going to talk about today is a tier list of specialty bars. We're using the more common ones, but they're uncommon enough that there's a good chance you guys don't have these at your gym. And I wanted to include a caveat right off the bat, especially for my younger viewers who might be training at a gym that's pretty ill equipped. Maybe you're training in your garage, maybe you're training at a YMCA, maybe you're training at some equivalent like small gym. You don't have any of these. That was me a long time ago, and especially back when I was in this era. Specialty bars were the shit. They were everything. Everybody good was using tons of specialty bars. The influence of conjugate was still around in lifting, and it concerned me. I was like, maybe the reason I'm not getting better and these other guys are is because I don't have this equipment. I think that this idea has gotten away, or not gotten away. It's decreased in powerlifting. If anything, people feel the reason they can't get better is because they don't have comp specific equipment, which still isn't the case. It's not necessarily about all these unspecific specialty bars, but I'm aware that on YouTube here, I'm in more of a general strength training space because I'm a general strength training kind of guy. And I figure that idea might be still a little bit more prevalent, that you need these specialty bars, or just getting access to these is going to boost you to the next level. And I promise you from personal experience, being that guy who had no specialty equipment whatsoever at the YMCA and got pretty strong, and then moved to my school gym and had a bit of equipment, and then moved to some real powerlifting and strength training gyms that had all the equipment in the world. I promise you that's not the number one factor between you and getting stronger. So please don't think that. I think that you could definitely hurt yourself with that mentality. And I promise you that even if there's a boost, even if there is a demand for a specific specialty bar within your training, that if you can figure out how to make continual good rates of progression on limited equipment, then later in your strength training career, because right now you don't have it, that's not a guarantee you will never have it. When you get on the equipment you need, if you have the fundamental understandings of training to where you could get stronger with the bare bones, you're going to enjoy a quick boost, and you're going to see even more progress because you mastered those fundamentals. So don't worry too much about a lack of equipment, whether it be certain machines, certain specialty bars. From a strength training perspective, it's almost a blessing in disguise to be forced to really master the basics and really identify what are the things that are holding you back. And it's not the absence of equipment. And especially some people, when they get into a gym and they have all these specialty bars, depending on your personality type, it might not even boost your rate of progression. It might actively hurt your rate of progression. If you're a real training ADHD kind of guy, you're not going to make regular measurable gains in, let's say, your back squat, because you're doing a different kind of squat every couple of weeks when you rewrite your program. So almost being forced into doing the same thing all the time could be a blessing in disguise for you, because that was something that it messed with me a little bit when I went to my first well-equipped gym. I was like, oh my God, I got to try everything here. I would see something else and be like, what if that not being in my program is what's holding me back? It's never the equipment. It's always something else. So we're going to get straight into this. We're going to knock out two that are barely specialty bars. I don't even have them on here. And that is going to be a squat bar and a deadlift bar. First, the squat bar. Long story short, what's the benefit of it? If you compete on it, you should probably get some training in on it. If you compete within the USAPL or any IPF affiliate, there is not really any value to ever using a squat bar for you. If you compete outside in powerlifting, outside of those two federations, there's a high chance you are going to be using a squat bar. It's not going to be a night and day difference unless you're quite strong, in which case maybe it's good to get some practice on it. It's a little thicker of a bar in diameter. It's also a little longer, so it's got a little bit of a different feel. Exposing yourself to that could be helpful. But that being said, until you're moving a lot of weight, you could certainly prepare for a powerlifting meet with what you've got if that's a regular gym barbell. The transition is not going to be too brutal most of the time. So the value is just, if it's what you compete on, it's what you use. If you're exotically strong, you can get a good squat bar that is stiffer than a regular power bar would be. It's going to decrease the whip, and it's going to make increasing your squat easier because you're being held back by whip, not strength at some point. Though that is pretty rare. If you are someone who is very strong and squatting a lot of weight, and you will find that a regular power bar is starting to hold you back, please do not buy a Texas squat bar. I genuinely think that a Texas squat bar is bendier and whippier than a regular 45-pound Ohio power bar. Go look for another squat bar if you really are that strong and you need something to reduce the whip. The Texas squat bar is just not going to get it done in my experience. A deadlift bar, again, if we compete in the USAPL or IPF affiliates, it is going to be useless. It's not what you compete on. It's easier than what you compete on. Not really the move. If you compete just about anywhere else outside of that, you are going to be competing on the deadlift bar, so you should train like you compete. It just makes deadlifting easier, though there is a little learning curve to pulling the slack. In that case, for you, a stiff bar is actually a specialty bar, which we would put in the S tier. If you're someone who competes on a deadlift bar, using a stiff bar as a variation or a specialty bar of sorts, absolutely S tier, phenomenal variation. We can pretend that that's a specialty case of what even defines a specialty bar. So the first one we're going to take a look at is probably just going to be the front squat harness, because this isn't a bar. It's kind of in spirit like a different way of loading a bar, to where, when you put the bar on this apparatus, it holds it in a front rack for you in such a way that it's almost making a specialty bar out of it, because it holds it in a way that's fairly different from actually front racking a squat. This, in theory, is great because lots of people don't have the mobility to do a good front rack. Lots of people find lots of discomfort and inconsistency with doing a cross grip. Theoretically, this is a wonderful invention that allows people to consistently get a good front squats in without having to worry about their mobility or the bar rolling quite as much. But in practical application, I think it fundamentally changes the lift. It gets rid of a lot of the benefits we'd be looking to get out of a straight bar front squat. At the bottom of most of the ones I've ever used stabs me in the thigh if I go too deep. And I think it takes away your ability to do a real more athletic, let's call it weightlifting style front squat, and it forces you into more of like a 90s 2000s era wide stance powerlifting squat to do them well. I'm not big on these. I would rather just have someone either work on their mobility until they can front rack, or just learn the nuances of doing a cross grip. I'm going to put this in the D tier. It is just not my cup of tea. Now, the next one we're going to take a look at is going to be a easy curl bar, just a bar with some squiggles in it. I prefer the full length rackable ones because it opens up the ability to like re-rack a set of skull crushers, which as they get heavier, kicking it into position is just a pain. It allows you to do, like, let's say some standing French presses from the rack. We don't have to kick it up every rep. Just opens up some cool options. What are we going to be using this bar for? Predominantly tricep motions and curls. For curls, it's awesome because many people do not have the mobility to properly, supinate their hand enough to do a straight bar curl. Just a regular barbell curl puts their wrist in a little bit of a weird position, and this alleviates that issue and lets them do discomfort-free curls. You can do a cool little reverse grip thumbless curl to get some forearm work in. Awesome for that. Fills those rolls very well. Let's see. And for triceps, lots of people find this less invasive on their elbows for skull crushers to grab this like squiggled bar rather than a straight bar. Also, again, kind of defeats some mobility obstacles. So as far as what it's meant to do, it's a pretty small scope. It's mostly just an arm training tool, but it's a great arm training tool, and it is a nice thing to have at your gym. Thankfully, this is probably, if we're defining this as a specialty bar, this is the most common specialty bar around, and it's a nice tool to have in your toolbox for arm training. I like the big one so I can go nice and heavy on some skull crushers out of the rack. I would like to buy one for my house sooner or later, but even the small ones get the job done. Good tool all around. Now, the next one we're going to look at is the axle bar. So what would we be doing with this? For the most part, what we're going to be doing with axle is probably three things, unless something slipped in my mind. We're going to deadlift with it, we are going to do grip training with it, and we are going to overhead press with it. For strongmen, obviously this would be S tier because you're asked to compete with this implement. You want to train on the stuff you compete on, right? So cool. But what about the rest of us who are just interested in general strength training? Does overhead pressing with this offer any significant merits? Some people find it's a little easier on the wrists and shoulders just grabbing a bigger diameter barbell. So if someone's had some like minor shoulder, elbow, wrist issues, doing some pressing on the axle, whether it be flat incline or overhead can alleviate that. So that's something that's kind of be a cool novelty. But other than that, we're not really gaining any significant change in the stimulus, other than maybe for some people it being a little bit more comfortable. Doing an axle continental clean, I think, is something that you generally should just do if you're competing in the axle. To overhead and strongman, I don't think it's a great general strength training tool, frankly. Deadlifting on this bar, it can be okay. It can just be a harder version, but usually if someone competes on a deadlift bar, or if they're just a gym lifter and they lift on a deadlift bar, the stiff bar is one deviation more difficult, and would be the better option, because it doesn't necessarily force you to use straps to go heavy like an axle would. Um, yeah, and it just doesn't change the mechanics so much as an axle would. So as a deadlift variation, it can be awesome for strongman to just rotate your deadlifts across the common bars you might be lifting on, whether it be axle, deadlift, stiff, a variety of heights and side handles, including axles somewhere in there can be an awesome variation. It's just challenging. The weight's shifted out in front of you. You have to start from a slightly lower position. It's one of the hardest deadlifts you can do, that's for sure. But I don't think it's necessarily this groundbreaking deadlift accessory. And then the third thing we can do, which is grip work, whether it's deadlift for reps or holds, it works quite well for that, frankly. It does that job quite well. I would think C tier, just because none of these things are all that unique. It doesn't really open up many options that you couldn't do with a regular bar. We could get in our grip training via deadlifts or holds on a regular bar if we needed to. We could just use a stiff bar as a deadlift variation. I don't think it's offering anything all that special, but it's a decent barbell to have at your disposable. So we'll probably put that bottom of B tier. We'll see if anything pushes ahead of that. To make it clear, that's the bottom of B tier or top of C tier. The next one we're going to look at is the earthquake bar. I'm sure you guys have seen someone on social media training on this, where you put some bands around it, you hang some plates off of it, and it's very unstable. It's all over the place. In the past, I think that there were periods of time where stability training was extremely overrated. Like, oh, it's going to get your stabilizer muscles so strong, and then you're going to see your bench press blow up. Like, it's pretty common to see it used most frequently for overhead pressing and bench pressing. Every now and then you'll see someone squat with it, which I just don't think is good. Don't think it's a good use of time necessarily. No one really deadlifts with it. So generally speaking, it's a press accessory where we're really challenging our stabilizers. More often than not, your stabilizers aren't the big limiting factor in your bench press. And if you were under the suspicion that stability was an issue, but you wanted to also train your strength at the same time, because there's no reason to just train one or the other, I would usually tell people to just use dumbbells, because they're a fairly heavy motion that's going to carry over to our bench well. It's going to build up all the muscles we're looking to build up. And it's also one deviation less stable. So if we can get good at dumbbell benching, chances are then whatever stability issue we had on a barbell bench is going to go away. So I think that largely dumbbells and how well they will carry over and develop pressing muscles would replace this in any program that I would write. The one thing that I think can be kind of nice about this bar is it's so self-limiting that it's almost like I've talked about how you can have a 1.5 frequency. So maybe you couldn't do heavy overhead twice a week, but if you do this self-limiting variation like a Z press, you can do 1.5. Well, this might be 1.25 or 2.25 because it's so self-limiting. And it can help with maybe some proprioceptive learning of the lift. I think that when I've done some instability work, and my friend Pete, who I think is a pretty smart guy, kind of mirrored the same thing of like, hey, I don't think this necessarily carried over tremendously, but I do find that I have a different understanding of what's going on in different parts of the lift. So I think it can be a good proprioceptive learning tool in trying to master a motor pattern, but I don't think it's any more than that. And I don't think it really necessitates a whole lot of use in training. It's something that if you can fit it in, you might find some nice little learning benefits for a little bit. And then once those learning benefits run dry, it's probably played out at that point. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is the trap bar. This is going to be a controversial one because it's kind of hard. It seems to be very divisive. If we're talking about general strength training purposes, I am not a huge fan of the trap bar. Yes, if we just use this as our deadlift metric, it lets most people with equal training lift more weight because we can keep that center of mass right over the center line of our foot, reduce that stress on our lower back. Oh, it feels nice. That's why I do trap bar deadlifts. That's perfectly valid. If this is your metric for deadlifting strength because you don't compete in anything and you just like trap bar deadlifts more because they feel nicer on your back and are easier, and that's how you measure your deadlifting strength, as long as you know it's easier, that is a-okay. As far as transference to other lifts, not really my cup of tea. It's kind of a bastardized half between a squat and a deadlift that isn't going to yield tremendous carryover to either, in my experience. Let's see. If you have an open-ended one, you can do split squats out of it. If one end is open, that's just super nice and a convenient way to load split squats. One thing that's going to boost this up in our ratings is this is the most common way that someone can do heavy loaded carries. Rather than be limited by the weight you have in dumbbells at your gym, trap bar is an easy way to start doing progressively heavier farmer's carries, which it adds a lot of function to this bar that it might not otherwise have. As far as whether it transfers to the squat, not really. Most often, you're not going to see significant transfer to a deadlift either. Maybe you could argue that for strongman, having some strength from a side handle position could be helpful, but I think generally if you're a strong deadlifter and a strong squatter, that you don't need too much work on a side handle apparatus to be quite good at it. You put those two elements together, you get a couple technique practice sessions in, to kind of learn the cueing of it. It's not something you need to regularly do to build up if you are a good squatter and a good deadlifter. Jasper, the guy I coach, very much kind of that way. We barely prepped for his side handle deadlift at his last show, and he did just fine because he's a great front squatter and he's a great deadlifter. So yeah, as a strength training tool, not really my cup of tea, but I think that those carries really matter. I think that's going to put it. Weighted carries are great. It's a great tool that most people have access to. We're going to go top of B tier, almost entirely carried off the back of those weighted carries. Now, the next one we're going to look at, kind of a rare one, you may not have seen this, is called a Mars bar. It is basically a low bar SSB. Stan Efferding's been using it a bit. I've seen a couple other people argue that, this is more specific to low bar, so I can get more low bar practice while sparing my arms, because that's one of the biggest drawbacks to a low bar squat, is that as you get stronger and stronger, it's going to be more taxing on your wrists, elbows, and shoulders, and might interfere with your bench training. So this is a perfect idea on paper. We're going to be able to get in more low bar training with our specific low bar motor patterns, while at the same time sparing our arms. In practical application, I see this used primarily to tell yourself that's what you're doing and inflate your numbers and feel really good about yourself. Most of the guys I know who have trained on this pretty quickly, if they're a proficient powerlifter, are lifting huge weights to where it's mostly just an ego lift. You probably want to make your train. If we're going to deviate, right? So in a perfect world, we could low bar with the arms spared, and that would be the only change. I don't think this is that, in my opinion. So if we're going to spare the arms and also change the lift, we would like to change it in a harder way rather than an easier way. So an SSB, where we're sparing the arms and making it mechanically more disadvantageous than a low bar, is going to be better than something where we're sparing the arms and making it more advantageous. So I'm not big on these. I think as far as options that are going to spare the arms, something that's going to let you lift more weight a lot of the time is not necessarily my first pick. Might be super cool for generalized training, just to lift a bunch of weight. But again, I don't think it's going to transfer over to the harder squat variations. Something like a front squat, a Duffalo bar, high bar, or any of these other specialty bars that are more difficult than a regular squat are going to carry over to the easier variations, but the reverse is not always true, right? So if we increase our regular SSB 100 pounds, our Mars bar squat it will probably have gone up a ton. If we increase our Mars bar squat, our SSB and our regular squat may not follow suit because it's the easier motion. And that's kind of where I draw the line with the trap bar as well, is when something is an easier variation, it's not always going to be my first choice. Now, the next one, this is a transformer bar. For those that are aware, you'll know it's an adjustable SSB. So we can adjust two things. We can adjust the angle at which the weights are cambered, so whether they're out in front of us or kind of hanging straight down from the bar in a regular camber. And we can also change the distance the weight is from the center bar. Basically, this opens up a million different squatting options. It's very much this multi-tool that it could be hard to rate because there's so many options opened up. And if you're very smart and honest with yourself, with your selection of your settings, this is a great tool. But almost everybody I see regularly use a uh, a transformer bar falls in the category of basically turning it into a Mars bar, putting it on like this ultra low bar setting that lets them squat even more than they can low bar, or justifying things that just feel good to them because they're not necessarily working weaknesses. So this is one of those ones where if you are someone who's very good at being honest with yourself, it can open up a ton of like really good options. The problem is many of us are not that good at being objective with ourselves and are going to find ways to rationalize using this thing in ways that it shouldn't. Because like I said, one of the big benefits is we're sparing the arms. And if we're going to spare the arms, we either want to make it equal to our main squatting variation or harder. And a lot of people are going to make this thing easier. And or it's just a novelty thing if you change the settings so often that you never really can tell if you're making progress. So the fact that it's so flexible is almost a downside in practical application for many people. But that being said, it'd be hard to shit on something if the main problem is just user error. So we are going to probably, if it will let me, put this as a top of B because it has the potential to be such a good tool. Many people just don't use it so. The next one we're going to look at, this is a rare one. It's called a spider bar. It is a combination of a squat camber bar and a SSB. So we are sparing the arms, but we're also setting that center of mass lower. And unlike an SSB, the weight is not really offset significantly in front of us. As far as transfer to powerlifting or squat backs, other squat variations, I do not like this bar. I just think that by lowering that center of mass, once you kind of get over the learning curve with this thing, many people will be able to squat more on this because they'll be able to get into these nice positions, really settle that center of mass quite low. And it's just not going to have great transference to a lift where the center of mass is higher and you're having these greater trunk stability demands placed on you. That being said, what's going to boost this thing up greatly is, okay, well, that's not the tool. That's not the slot I would use this for. Is it's not going to be a great squat variation necessarily for building up our squat strength in other variations. But as a purely bodybuilding free squat pattern, right? Lots of people will say, well, you don't have to barbell squat. You could front squat. I mean, you don't have to do, hypothetically, you could build up all these muscles without any squat patterned work in general. A squat patterned motion is a very, very, very helpful developmental tool for the legs. So I don't really know why you would write a program in the absence of injury that doesn't have a squat pattern motion. It could even be a hack squat. That's the squat pattern motion from a bodybuilding perspective. But we have this freedom of we're looking for the stimulus, not necessarily the motion. And from a bodybuilding perspective, I think the spider bar is awesome. John Meadows, I used a little picture of him because he was a big fan of it. Also Hunter Labrada, I think top 4 at the Olympia last year. Very smart guy, very quickly up and coming, very interested in optimizing his training. Big fan of this bar as well. I've seen him use it quite a bit because, again, there's no reason to tax our upper body at all with a back squat necessarily for bodybuilding. And the fact that it is lower to the ground and more stable makes it easier to make the musculature rather than the stabilization and balance and technique the limiting factor. So as a bodybuilding tool, this probably would be my go-to squat. If I had one and you told me, Sam, I want you to try to grow your legs as much as you can, I would probably use this as the free squat that I utilize in my program. So for that goal, I think it's an awesome, awesome squat variation that if you learn how to use it, that greater stability of having that weight nice and low could be a big benefit while also sparing your arms. Now, the next one we're going to look at here, we're going to skip over the squat camber because that's very similar, and I don't want to repeat a bunch of the same shit twice in a row. We're going to look at something that's kind of rare. This is very old school. I believe his name was Mike McDonald. There was this bencher in like the 80s or something who was benching at a level that would be highly, highly competitive today. And he attributed a lot of that to this specific specialty bar. A lot of people call it a McDonald bar because of that. I believe he had one custom made. It is a bench cambered bar. So it's a regular bench. It's a regular bar with a curve just in the center that will allow you to get a deeper stretch at the bottom of a bench press while also grabbing normal parallel handles just like you would on a barbell. Some people find that if you ease into this, like if you don't ease into this, you get into it too quickly. It can be a little aggressive on the shoulder, so it's something to be wary of. But if you ease into this and you master this motion, this is one of the most helpful things I've ever done for general power off the chest. It's a really, really good specialty bar. It serves its one specific purpose really well. And then the other thing that it can be used for is getting a greater range of motion on seal rows. So that way the camber will warp and wrap around the bench. We can get a little deeper elbow position. And we tend to believe and we tend to know that a greater range of motion is going to equate to greater hypertrophic response, all things considered equal. So really good bar, fills its roles very well. It's not going to be some night and day, giant difference maker for you necessarily, but the roles that it's asked to fill, it fills very well. The next one we're going to look at is a squat camber bar. The primary goal of using a squat camber bar for the most part is going to be another option of sparingly arms, just like a SSB, a transformer, a Mars bar, or a Duffalo bar. All of these are mostly trying to solve that problem of when we're back squatting really heavy, our arms get banged up. So sometimes we can do our back squatting on these specialty bars and spare our arms. One other thing that it introduces is a element of instability, as the weights will swing around that axis on your back, which can kind of force people into a slower tempo, which can be a big benefit of the bar. I think if you train on it enough, you can acclimate to that lower center of mass and maybe the slightly slower bar speed needed to prevent oscillation. And I do know people that actually squat more on a camber bar. So that could be something to bear in mind, as you could probably argue that some people will overuse this bar. But I do think it's a good training tool. For strongmen, it very much simulates the positions of a yoke, which, is a novel little thing. It's a good way to get in leg training without taxing the shoulders, elbows, and wrists. It serves the purpose well. I think it's kind of from a bodybuilding perspective, that instability makes it not necessarily as good an option as the spider bar. And from a strength training perspective, I almost like to see the higher specificity offered by either the Duffalo bar or the higher difficulty offered by the SSB. But that being said, it does its job well. Now, the next one we're going to talk about, which I just mentioned, is going to be a Duffalo bar or a Yukon bar or whatever other, or a Buffalo bar if we go back. It's just a bent barbell. What are we looking to do with this? Generally two things. One is an option of getting in more squatting, but due to the curvature of the bar, reducing the stress on our wrists, elbows, and shoulders. The nice thing that's offered about this is the mechanics are a lot more similar to a straight bar squat, so the skill transference is going to be there. You could spend so much time on this. A straight bar feels very foreign, but rotating this in is a good way to reduce that arm pain a little bit. For if you're a bigger guy with a bigger bench press and you've been having trouble with your low bar squats, this is a great tool that's going to let you maintain a little bit more specificity than had you used something like a squat camber bar. The other option that you can do with this is extended range of motion benching, much the same as the bench camber bar / McDonald bar. I prefer the McDonald bar for this because I think that you could argue that grabbing along a straight handle is a little bit more of a normal feel than benching with the camber of the Duffalo bar. Again, much like the McDonald bars, if you go into this too aggressively, some people will find that it'll bang up their shoulders pretty quickly and it's not the move for them. But if it's well tolerated, it is another great tool for building up power off the chest, of basically creating a small deficit bench press. For really wide grip people, I think that trying to touch your chest with it might be a bit too much, but I think it's a great tool. I usually prefer a McDonald bar over it, but I think they both get that job done. This also offers the benefit of being a low bar squat with reduced stress on the shoulders. So I would say that means it automatically has to outperform the bench camber bar as a tool for power lifters, because it's got two purposes and it serves both of them well. Second to last one we're going to look at is going to be a Swiss bar / football bar. Usually the differentiation a lot of people will make between Swiss and football is whether the handles are slightly askew or run parallel. I can't say it makes a huge difference. One of the nice parts about a football bar, which I think is the one where they run parallel, is it can get you acclimated to pressing on neutral handles, which can be helpful for strongmen who maybe have done all of their pressing on a straight bar and are having a hard time adjusting to pressing on the log. Aside from that, it's It's a bar that allows many people who have pain on a straight bar bench press to press without pain. So that automatically is going to give it a decent rating, as it just allows more people to do pain-free resistance training. It's a difficult variation in many ways. Maybe we're going to bias towards the shoulders and the triceps a little bit more, depending on the handle we grab. The biggest issue I have with this bar is many of them suffer from stability issues at the wrist, which is not necessarily what we would like to be challenging with it. Lots of people will find that just stabilizing that bar will roll the wrists over and over and over, and that's probably not the stimulus we're looking to get out of the bar. If you have something like I believe it's the Kabuki Cadillac bar, or the many equivalents other companies have made, where it is a football bar or a Swiss bar with a camber, and we're getting that deep stretch position, so we get some of those benefits we get from the Yukon bar, Duffalo bar, or from the bench camber bar, but we also get to challenge that more neutral position. And also the camber makes it so the weights don't swing around as much, so it doesn't have that crazy stability at the wrist. So we'll say a regular straight football or Swiss bar would be top of B tier, just because it does let people do pain-free training for their shoulders. I just don't like that instability at the wrist. If this was a Swiss or football bar with a camber, like the Cadillac bar, and we also get that benefit of training with a little bit greater range of motion, which might decrease our propensity towards pec tweaks, I would put that at the bottom of A tier. So pretend this one has the camber in it, and then bada boom, bada bing, we save the best for last. SSB is S tier. There's so many reasons that this is a good variation. Yes, it spares the, again, wrists, elbows, and shoulders, huge benefit in itself. But it's also just, most SSBs are built in such a way that it makes for a wonderfully challenging squat variation. Because the load is offset in front of you, it can be very challenging on the quads. Because the weight is trying to bend you forward the whole time, it can be extremely challenging on your trunk and mid-back strength. And generally speaking, almost anybody would see at least some carryover from developing their strength in a well-executed SSB. So it serves a purpose that is a very common purpose, and it serves it damn well. It probably carries over to a deadlift a bit better than most other squatting variations would, bar maybe a front squat. It's a great option for strongmen who don't need to squat on a straight bar ever, but want the benefits of a back squat. Maybe they really want to prioritize their deadlift because it's more relevant to their competition. All of these things make an SSB a great option. Builds the hell out of your trunk strength, as I mentioned, mid-back strength. It's probably the most practical and best way to do good mornings. You can do JM presses with it. I think that's more of a novelty lift that doesn't really boost its status, but it's another use for it. And it's also great for doing heavy split squats once you don't have dumbbells heavy enough. So absolutely S tier, fills so many purposes so well that I'm very biased towards it. So I put it in the S tier. This has been my tier list. Thank you guys for watching.